Hello, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of Steps in Getting Better at Art. So, this will be episode 4, and we'll be focusing on rendering, more specifically, the glass texture. Start off with a green color for the base. I'll show you in a minute why I do that, because glass is, transparent and translucent material. It'll be easier to distinguish it from the background. So use the color palette as usual and use the first shading color. Then erase the center using an airbrush, and you can add a new layer for the second shading color. Now I'm trying to use the reference here to know what glass would look like if it's spherical in shape. Now use your third or last shading color, which is the darkest color, and color around the edges using a soft brush. And try to do some little bit adjustments. Now for the highlights, of course, I use a soft brush from the bottom up and the sides. Try to make sure that none of it is too blurred, since we want hard edges for the highlights. Erase stuff with the airbrush. Then I blur the second shading color. I switch the background to gray to mimic the references so it's easier to see, instead of having it just to be green and white. So I'll show you what it looks like when the background changes. So I added this first shading color again with a soft brush covering the inner parts, to add more depth and to show that this glass sphere is casting a shadow, since even transparent objects would cast a shadow, especially when it touches the surface, in this case the background. Now for the highlights, I duplicated it and used a Gaussian blur filter, but this time I'll be erasing only some parts. Now as you can see, I tried to make the background red, and I'll show you how to make the sphere follow the color of the background. I would use a darker and more saturated color and use a clipping mask for the first and second shading layer. As you can see, as for the darkest shading color, which is shading 3, I also use a clipping mask, but this time an even more darker and more saturated red color. In the end, I would select the base shape of the glass sphere, and I would use an overlay layer using a more saturated and bright red with the gradient tool. And I just smooth it out, erase it with the airbrush to make it more seamless. Next is a flask or a potion bottle. Now I would use the same techniques, but since the references kind of use more of a rough type of brush, more textured brush for the shading, I try my best to make sure it's not too rough, at the same time following the previous example, having a little bit more smooth texture. Start off with the first shading color. Start off with gray and the green base color as I did previously. And with the second shading color, covering some parts of the bottle. Now you can see that the cork is already rendered, but since this video is focused more on the glass material, I would just cut that out. I use the last shading color with a soft brush and erase the ends using the same brush to create a sharper, more hard edge to show that glass is smooth. I use the soft brush with the first shading color on another layer to showcase the depth of the bottle. So I use a soft brush, and then I erase the inner parts using an airbrush as softly and gently as possible. I would then blur out the edges of that part. Now I switched over to a darker color since I believe that it will look way better than the previous one. Now for the highlights, I use a soft brush, of course, forming the edges of the bottle. And just a little bit of cleanup using a soft brush, making hard edges, as well as the reflective part of the glass bottle. Now you see that I tried to experiment with the background following the reference on the top left with the red liquid, with the red potion. So I just changed the color of the background and changed the base color of green over to the same color. Now as you can see, the bottle looks a little bit messy, so I try to clean it up by going to each individual layer and try to clean it up using a soft brush, an airbrush first and then a soft brush. I always turn my layers invisible and visible to see which one looks better. I also changed the shading, the colors of the shading layers following the background and turning the saturation up while turning the value down, as you can see here with the clipping mask, as I did previously with the glass sphere in the first part. Now for this blurry part, or for this gradient part of the bottle, I'm trying to decide which one looks better. If it's better for it to be dark or a lighter shade of the background. And I ended up picking the lighter shade. Just some more highlights. I erased it using this soft brush. Then duplicate the highlights layer and use a Gaussian blur filter. Next, time for the liquid. There's a little bit more details here. Use an airbrush to erase the darker parts of the liquid in the middle. Now for the highlights of the liquid, I used a slightly brighter and less saturated red. So in this part, I'm trying to decide if overlay looks better than color dodge, but in the end, I decided to stick with color dodge and try to play around with the opacity as well. As you can see here, don't forget to add a new layer with a kind of lilac or lavenderish color using a soft brush for the edges of the bottle. This shows I don't know what it's specifically called, but it's where light gets reflected from the background onto the glass bottle as well from behind. So it's opposite of the highlights. And add a new normal layer using that same color for the top half of the glass bottle. And try to reduce the opacity and erase it with the soft brush and then the airbrush in the end to show a more reflective aspect of the potion. And that's pretty much it for the video. Thanks for watching, and see you in the next tutorial.